I'm Jenny Batt, and I'm going to be talking about a labouring class poet called Mary Leaper. In this talk, I'm going to focus on a writer who is, to my mind, one of the most exciting writers of the 18th century. Mary Leaper was a kitchen maid who wrote accomplished verses and who won accolades from literary society. She's a vibrant and lively poet who offers a unique and often very funny perspective on mid-18th century society. Despite her social position, her lowly social position, she's seldom deferential and never obsequious. When she's writing about any of her patrons, she's more likely to tease and mock them than she is to prostrate herself in gratitude before them. She's ambitious, but she refuses to take herself or her poetry too seriously. She's an exciting talent, a writer who, when she found time to spare in her busy working day, snatched moments to compose poems and plays. She could have been one of the most important writers of the 18th century. But her life was cut tragically short, and she died at the age of just 24. Mary Leaper's one of a group of poets who come to increasing prominence in the 18th century. Writers from labouring class backgrounds who lack much formal education and who combined their writing with more prosaic demands of working life. There were agricultural labourers like Stephen Duck, bricklayers like Henry Jones, washerwomen like Mary Collier, milkwomen like Anne Yearsley, and kitchen maids like Mary Leaper. Mary Leaper was born in 1722 and she grew up in the town of Brackley in Northamptonshire, where her father was a gardener. She probably attended a local school, and once she had learnt to read, she devoured everything that she could get her hands on. She began writing verse at the precociously young age of 10 or 11, and but this at first amused her parents, her mother in particular. But over time, her parents began to worry that verse was becoming too much of a distraction and was taking her away from more profitable employments. At some point, it's not quite clear when, Leaper left home to go and work as a kitchen maid. While she was working at a house called Weston Hall, her poetic inclinations came to the attentions of her employer, Susanna Jennens. This was an important moment for Leaper, and Jennens became the first of two very important mentors to the young poet. Jennens encouraged Leaper to write and gave her access to the library at Weston Hall, and in doing so, helped the young poet grow in confidence. The poetical kitchen maid didn't always meet with such encouragement from her employers, however. In her next job, working for the Chauncey family at Edgecote House, it was noted that her desire to write verses sometimes took her attention away from her duties. One story recorded that her fondness for writing verses displayed itself by her sometimes taking up her pen while the jack was standing still and the meat scorching. So rather than turning the meat she's being paid for, she's turning over verse in her head, neglecting her duties. After several years of plying her trade as a kitchen maid, Leaper returned home to Brackley. Her mother had died some years before, and so Leaper's new occupation was to look after her father's house and help out with his business. And it was at this point that she met the second of her two important mentors. This was a woman named Bridget Freemantle, the daughter of a local clergyman. Leaper's writing had acquired her some local notoriety by this point. Freemantle had heard of this and decided to make the young poet's acquaintance. This was really important for Leaper. She'd gone back to live and work in her father's house, but her father, by his own admission, had no taste for poetry. He had stopped trying to completely dissuade her from writing poetry, but he wasn't the most receptive of audiences. And from the hints that she gives in her writing, her other local readers weren't always receptive or sympathetic or stimulating audiences either. So in Bridget Freemantle, Leaper found the very audience, the outlet that she required. For the next year or so, Leaper and Freemantle saw each other 2 or 3 times a week. Leaper addressed a significant quantity of verse to her, and in these verses she ranged across poetry, fame, religion, and the place of women within contemporary society. And she also created a vivid comic portrait in these poems of the world in which she was living. One of her poems to Fremantle is called Crumble Hall, and it is this poem which has attracted the most attention from modern critics. It's a country house poem with a twist. Country house poems are usually celebrations of a particular grand house and the landscape in which it sits, and the noble owner who commands over it. Leaper's twist on this in Crumble Hall is to offer a view of this great house and the landscape and its inhabitants, all from a servant's perspective. What her portrait of the great house reveals is not the magnificent patron who commands over it, but the servants who are central to its functioning. Crumble Hall is based on Edgecote House, where Leaper used to work. It's a house with a great history, and in her poem, Leaper sketches some of that in. She refers to its hospitable door, which has fed the strangers and relieved the poor. Its Gothic towers and its rusty spires were known of old to knights and hungry squires, she says. But the illustrious past of Crumble Hall is not really what Leaper's interested in. What she wants to show is what's going on behind the scenes, so that rather than dwelling on the impressive grand hall, for example, she points to the cobwebs high up in the corners of its ceiling that the servants can't reach when they're doing their cleaning. She skips over the ornate tapestries that hang on the wall, and instead she lingers in the dark passages where the mice run, the attics filled with junk, old shoes, bits of broken plough, and stacks of wool filled with sheep ticks. And what of the noble inhabitants of this house? Well, we see fleetingly one of the noble inhabitants asleep in the library. And there's a critical account of another's plans for renovating the house and gardens. But the real life in this house is in the kitchen. And Leaper's poem stays in the kitchen longer than it does anywhere else. Here, among several characters, we meet Ursula and Roger. Roger, overstuffed with beef, with cabbage much too full, and dumpling too, fit emblem of his skull, with mouth wide open but with closing eyes. He's lying on the kitchen table, fast asleep. While he snores contentedly, Ursula looks at him, and with dejected eyes, "Ah, Roger, ah," the mournful maiden cries, "is wretched Ursula then your care no more, that while I sigh, thus you can sleep and snore? Ingrateful Roger, wilt thou leave me now? For you these furrows mark my fading brow, for you my pigs resign their morning dew, my hungry chickens lose their meat for you. And was it not for thee, no goodly pottage would be dressed by me. For thee, these hands wind up the whirling jack, or place the spit across the sloping rack. I baste the mutton with a cheerful heart, because I know my Roger will have parts." Here we see one of Leaper's talents, creating vivid characters and dramatic, comic, tragic scenes. One of the biggest processes in the great house is the feeding of all its inhabitants, but here in Leaper's hands it becomes a tiny domestic drama. Ursula isn't motivated by respect for her employers or any thoughts of financial reward. No, she says, she's doing it all for Roger. Knowing that he'll have a part in what she cooks makes it all worthwhile, it makes it bearable. It's delusional and self-aggrandising, but it's also very human and tragic. All her love and devotion directed towards unwieldy Roger, who's snoring his heart out obliviously. Crumble Hall draws on and dramatises Leaper's experiences as a maid, but elsewhere in her writing, she's adamant that her social status should not become the most important thing about her. 15 years earlier, a poet called Stephen Duck, an agricultural labourer turned poet, had become very, very famous. And though he left his labouring background far behind him, he found it enormously hard to shed the label of labourer poet. Leaper didn't want the same label to be attached ineradicably to her own writing. And when it was put to her that foregrounding her biography might make her poetry more saleable, she objected. She wanted her work to stand or fail on its own literary merits. And together with Fremantle, she set about planning the publication of her work. They talked about sending her poems to magazines and newspapers and explored the possibility of publishing a volume of her work and getting her play staged. Within a few years, the recognition that Leaper had dreamed of came her way. When her poems were published, they attracted the attention of major literary figures of the day, such as the novelist Samuel Richardson and the poets John Duncombe, Isaac Hawkins Brown and Christopher Smart. Her work was included in an important anthology called Poems by Eminent Ladies, a collection that celebrated women's writing, and her inclusion in there signalled that she was being identified as one of the leading female poets of the age. But sadly, Leaper did not live to receive these accolades. Indeed, she did not live to see any of her works in print. She died at the age of 24 in November 1746 after contracting measles. With her death, a great talent was brought to a premature end. If she had lived, there is no doubt that she would have gone on writing. What would she have written? Would she have written more plays? What kind of success would she have had? And how would she have responded to it? Would she have stayed in Brackley or moved to London in pursuit of a literary career? These are unanswerable questions, of course, but rather than mourning what she didn't have the chance to write, we are fortunate enough to have a compelling body of work produced over the course of her short life. 100 or so poems, 1 complete play and fragments of 2 others. And I do encourage you to go and investigate the work of Mary Leaper, who was a young poet of great promise, one of the most witty, original and, to my mind, truly inspirational writers of the 18th century.